The knock on the door came just after dusk, 3 soft raps. Not polite, not a neighbor. It was the kind of knock that meant your life, as you knew it, was over. Inside, Abel Harrow put down his mug. He was a big man, built of silence and hard work. Across the room, his wife Lorna stopped folding a quilt, her hands frozen in midair. They didn't get visitors, not after dark, not unless trouble had followed them home. Abel's first thought was a traveler, maybe some poor soul looking for a day's work, but the feeling in his gut told him different. This felt like fate. Lorna's eyes met his. No fear, just a deep, settled caution that had lived between them for years. He rose from his chair, his shadow swallowing the small cabin, and walked to the door. He didn't grab the rifle from above the mantel. He should have. When he pulled the heavy door open, the lantern light bled into the twilight and fell on 2 figures. 2 small, impossible figures. A little girl, no bigger than a fence post, was clutching a bundled-up baby boy to her chest. Her dress was worn to nothing, her feet were bare and bleeding. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, but her eyes held the hardness of 100 winters. The little boy in her arms stirred, his round face pale in the light. He looked to be about 1.5 years. The girl lifted her chin, and her voice, when it came, was a razor blade. It sliced right through the quiet evening air. "You are childless," she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. Her gaze was locked on his, steady and accusing. "And Mama died 2 days ago." Silence. The kind of silence that's so heavy you can feel it pressing on your bones. Abel could smell the dust, the wood smoke, and something else under it all. Grief. Cold and sharp. Lorna made a small sound, a choked gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, but Abel didn't move. He crouched down, slow and steady, so he was eye level with the little girl. He kept his voice low, like he was calming a spooked horse. "What's your name, little one?" She blinked once, just once. Her grip on her brother tightened. "Nora," she whispered, "and this is Henry. He's hungry." As if on cue, the baby let out a pitiful whimper. It was a sound that tore right through Abel. He felt something crack open inside him, a place he'd bricked up long ago. He glanced back at Lorna. Her eyes were swimming with a pain he knew all too well. The pain of an empty cradle, the pain of a quiet house. They had prayed for children, they had bargained with God, and every time the answer had been silence. Now, silence had brought them this. Nora's small shoulders sagged, but she didn't put her brother down. She had carried him this far. She wasn't about to stop now. Abel reached out a big, calloused hand. He touched her arm so gently it was like he was touching a ghost. "You've carried him far," he said. "Step inside. You'll not stand in the dust tonight." The girl didn't move. Her jaw was set. She looked at him, really looked at him, like she was trying to see straight into his soul, as if she expected the kindness to be a trick. Then, she took a single, shaky step across the threshold. The lantern light hit her full in the face, and Abel saw it then. The dirt, the exhaustion, the hollows under her eyes. But he also saw something else. A flicker of stubborn fire, a refusal to break. Lorna moved past him, her hands trembling as she gently took the baby from Nora's arms. "Poor lamb," she murmured, her voice thick with tears. "Come, we'll get you warm and fed." Abel closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking shut felt deafeningly final. A line had been drawn. The life they knew was on one side. This new, terrifying, unknown life was on the other. Nora stood stiffly by the table. Her fists were still clenched. "We don't need much," she said, her voice stronger now. "Just someone who won't leave us alone." Those words, they hit Abel harder than a punch. He saw it in her eyes then, the raw terror of a world that had already abandoned her once. He sank to one knee in front of her. The floorboards creaked under his weight. "From now on," he said, and the words were a vow, a promise sealed in that dusty cabin. "We are your parents." The little girl's chin began to tremble. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. She turned her head away, ashamed to let him see her cry. Lorna brushed a lock of hair from Nora's forehead. "You don't have to carry this burden alone anymore," she whispered, and for the first time in a long time, the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt full, crowded with hopes and fears so big they threatened to push the walls down. But as Abel watched the little girl, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. Her eyes kept darting toward the window, toward the dark, empty prairie beyond. She wasn't just looking for a home. She was watching for something, or someone, and the way she flinched every time the wind rattled the shutters told Abel everything he needed to know. These children weren't just orphans. They were fugitives. They were on the run, and they had brought the trouble right to his door. The first night was a long one. Abel didn't sleep. He sat in his chair by the hearth, the rifle now resting across his lap, and he listened. He listened to the soft breathing of the children, tucked into a makeshift bed near the fire. He listened to the house settle, but mostly he listened to the silence outside. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sent a jolt through him. He kept seeing that look in Nora's eyes, the look of a hunted animal. What had this 6-year-old girl seen? Who had she been running from? Her words echoed in his mind. "Mama died 2 days ago." It wasn't just grief in her voice, it was something else. A carefully constructed wall. Morning came, and with it, the smell of Lorna's baking. It was a smell that usually meant peace, but not today. Today, it felt like a fragile shield against the world. Nora sat at the table, her back ramrod straight. She held a tin cup of milk in both hands, watching him over the rim. Her eyes were old, too old for a child. Henry, on the other hand, was a different story. He sat on Lorna's lap, happily smearing jam on his face. He giggled, a pure, sweet sound that felt alien in the tense cabin. For a moment, just a moment, Abel let himself imagine this life. A life with laughter, a life with muddy boots by the door. Then he looked at Nora, and the cold reality came crashing back. He cleared his throat. "That bread's better with butter," he said, trying for a normal, fatherly tone. Nora's eyes narrowed. "We don't need nothing fancy." "Child," Lorna said softly, her hand covering Nora's. "Butter isn't fancy. It's just kindness." Nora flinched at the word. She took the butter, but her movements were jerky, suspicious. As she ate, Abel watched her. He saw the way she held her small body, coiled like a spring, ready to bolt at any second. After breakfast, she insisted on washing her own plate. She scrubbed it with a fierce determination, as if she was trying to wash away more than just crumbs. Lorna knelt beside her. No child should carry so much weight alone. Nora's chin shot up. "Mama said we had to be strong. She said folks don't always take in orphans, so we have to prove we're worth the trouble." The words landed like stones in Abel's gut. What kind of world makes a 6-year-old prove her worth? He stepped forward, placing his hand on the table. The wood was solid and real under his palm. "You don't need to prove a thing here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You hear me? Not a thing." Her eyes darted up to his. He saw a flicker of something, a desperate desire to believe him. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that same guarded mistrust. Later that day, while Lorna was napping with Henry, Abel found Nora in the barn. She was standing in an empty stall, running her small hand over a rough-hewn plank of wood. He approached quietly. "What are you doing out here?" She jumped, startled. She tried to hide something behind her back, but it was too late. He saw it. A small, crudely carved wooden bird. "What is that?" he asked gently, her eyes filled with panic. "Nothing. It's nothing." "Let me see." He held out his hand. She shook her head, clutching the bird to her chest. "Mama gave it to me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She said never to lose it. She said it would keep us safe. A child's trinket, a keepsake." But Abel knew it was more than that. The sheer terror on her face told him this little bird was a key to whatever they were running from. He crouched down in front of her. "Nora, who are you running from? Who did this to your mama?" Tears streamed down her face. She shook her head violently. "I can't tell. He'll find us. He said he'd find us. Who, Nora? Who will find you?" She just sobbed, her small body shaking with a fear so profound it made Abel's blood run cold. He pulled her into his arms, and she didn't resist. She buried her face in his shirt, her tiny fists grabbing a fistful of his homespun cotton. He held her tight, feeling the terrible weight of her secrets. He looked out the barn door, at the long, lonely stretch of land that was his home. For the first time, it didn't feel safe. It felt exposed. That night, after the children were asleep, he told Lorna about the bird. She listened, her face pale in the lamplight. "What are we going to do, Abel?" she whispered. He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that they had taken these children in. They had made a promise, and now some unknown evil was hunting them. He looked over at the sleeping children. Their faces were peaceful in the dim light. They looked like angels, but they were angels with a devil on their trail. A few days later, Abel decided he needed answers. He couldn't protect them if he didn't know what he was fighting. He told Lorna he was going into town for supplies, a half-day's ride away. It was a lie. He was going to find the sheriff. He saddled his horse before dawn, the air crisp and cold. As he was about to mount, Nora appeared at the cabin door. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice small. "Just to town," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "We need flour." She stared at him, her eyes searching his face. "You're going to tell someone about us," she said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of betrayal. "You're going to send us away." "No," he said, his voice rough. "Never." But she didn't believe him. He could see it in the way she wrapped her arms around herself, creating a tiny, impenetrable fortress. The ride to town was tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. He kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone following him. He was starting to feel like the hunted one himself. The town was a single dusty street, lined with false front buildings. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. He found the sheriff, a man named Silas Croft, in his office. Croft was a big man with a florid face and eyes that were a little too close together. Abel told him a modified version of the story. 2 orphans found on his land, their mother dead from a fever up north. He left out the fear, the carved bird, the feeling of being watched. He just wanted to see what the sheriff knew. Croft leaned back in his chair, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. "Harrow," he said with a slow drawl. "Never took you for the charitable type." "They're just children, Silas," Abel said, keeping his voice even. "Orphans, you say? From up north?" Croft squinted at him. "Funny. Haven't heard of any sickness sweeping through those parts." A chill went down Abel's spine. "That's what the girl said." "Is that so?" Croft stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the empty street. "Well, I'll put out the word. See if anyone's missing a pair of kids." He turned back, a strange smile on his face. "But don't you worry. Folks around here mind their own, as long as you ain't bringing trouble down on us." The words were a warning, a clear, unmistakable warning. Abel left the office with his heart pounding. Croft knew something, or he suspected something. That wasn't the reaction of a man hearing about 2 lost children. It was the reaction of a man who had been waiting for them to surface. On his way out of town, he stopped at the mercantile. He bought the flour he'd lied about just to keep up appearances. As he was paying, he saw it. Hanging on a hook behind the counter was a string of small, carved wooden birds, identical to the one Nora was clutching as if her life depended on it. His blood turned to ice. He forced himself to stay calm. "Those are interesting carvings," he said to the shopkeeper, a twitchy little man named Elias. Elias glanced at the birds, then back at Abel, his eyes darting nervously. "Just some trinkets. A local fella carves 'em, sells 'em now and then." "Who's the carver?" Abel asked, his voice low. Elias swallowed hard. I I don't rightly know his name. He's new to these parts. Keeps to himself." It was another lie. The man was terrified. Abel could smell it on him. He paid for his flour and left. As he mounted his horse, he glanced back at the sheriff's office. Silas Croft was standing in the doorway, watching him. Their eyes met across the dusty street. And in that moment, Abel knew. The evil they were running from wasn't some far-off threat. It wasn't a stranger out on the prairie. It was right here, in this town, and the sheriff was part of it. He spurred his horse, racing back towards the ranch. The quiet homestead that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a trap. He had to get back. He had to protect them. But he had a horrifying thought. He had led the fox right to the henhouse. By going to the sheriff, he hadn't found help. He had just announced to the wolves exactly where the lambs were hiding. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of dust and dread. Abel pushed his horse harder than he ever had before, his mind racing. The carved birds, the sheriff's veiled threat, the shopkeeper's terror. It was all connected. He burst into the cabin, startling Lorna. "We have to be ready," he said, his voice grim. "Trouble's coming." He didn't have time to explain everything. He just told her that the town wasn't safe, that the sheriff couldn't be trusted. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a steely resolve. Lorna was a rancher's wife. She knew how to face a storm. That night he didn't sit in the chair. He boarded up the smaller windows and placed the rifle by the door. He took the old hunting knife from his pack and laid it on the table. They were on an island, surrounded by a sea of enemies who wore friendly faces. He needed to know more. He needed the truth from Nora. After Lorna had taken Henry to bed, he sat down with the little girl. He took the wooden bird from his pocket, the one he'd bought at the mercantile, and placed it on the table next to her. She gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "Nora," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I know you're scared, but you have to tell me everything. It's the only way I can protect you." She stared at the two birds, her small face a mask of misery. Finally, the story came tumbling out, in whispers and sobs. Her mother's name was Sarah. She had been a seamstress in a town a few days east. A man had come to town, a charming, well-dressed man who wanted to buy up all the land. He offered people pennies on the dollar, and when they refused, bad things started to happen. Barns burned, livestock disappeared. Sarah had refused to sell. Their little plot of land had been in her family for generations, and she had something he wanted, a deed, an old forgotten deed that proved her land included a freshwater spring, the only one for 50 miles. That spring made the land priceless. The charming man was Silas Croft, before he was a sheriff. One night he came to their house. He wasn't charming anymore. He demanded the deed. Sarah refused. He tore the house apart looking for it, but he couldn't find it. Nora had been hiding under the bed, clutching Henry. She saw everything. She saw him strike her mother, saw her fall, saw him stand over her, his face twisted with rage. He hadn't found the deed. Before he left, he grabbed Nora. He told her he would find her, and when he did, he would finish what he started. He told her no one would ever believe a little girl. He told her he was an important man. After he left, Sarah had clung to life for 2 more days. She made Nora promise to run. She gave her the carved bird, which held a secret, and she told her where to go. "Find the Harrows," she had whispered with her last breath. "Find Abel and Lorna. They are good people. Your father knew them. Tell them Sarah sent you." Abel felt the air leave his lungs. My father? Who was her father? But the final piece of the story hit him like a physical blow. Sarah had stuffed the real deed, the one Croft was willing to kill for, inside the tiny, hollowed-out wooden bird. And then she'd given her daughter a second, identical bird as a decoy. Nora pointed a trembling finger at the bird she had carried all this way. "The deed is in there," she whispered. "He wants this." Abel's world tilted on its axis. This wasn't just about protecting 2 orphans. This was about a murder, a land grab, and a corrupt lawman who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, and somehow they were connected to it all through a man they'd never even met. He looked at the tiny, 6-year-old girl who had witnessed a murder, protected her baby brother, and walked for days through the wilderness, all while clutching the evidence that could destroy a powerful man. He felt a surge of awe, followed by a wave of cold, hard fury. "He's not going to get it," Abel said, his voice like flint. "And he's not going to get you." Just then, a sound from outside cut through the night. The distinct, unmistakable sound of a horse approaching the ranch. Not fast, slow and deliberate. The sound of a predator closing in. Abel grabbed the rifle. He looked at Lorna, who was standing in the doorway to the bedroom, her face white as a sheet, holding a sleeping Henry. He looked at Nora, whose eyes were fixed on the door, her body frozen in absolute terror. He had promised them they were home. He had promised them they were safe. Now he had to make good on that promise. The knock came, not the soft, uncertain knock of two children. This was a hard, authoritative knock, the knock of a man who didn't expect to be denied. The devil was at their door. Abel motioned for Lorna to take the children into the back room and stay quiet. He walked to the door, the heavy rifle feeling like a part of his own arm. He didn't open it. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady. "Sheriff Croft," came the reply. "Just making my rounds, Abel. Heard some strange noises out this way. Thought I'd check you and the missus were all right." It was a lie. A flimsy, transparent lie. He was here for the children. He was here for the deed. He was hunting. "We're fine, Sheriff," Abel said, his back pressed against the solid wood of the door. "No need to trouble yourself." There was a pause. Abel could almost feel Croft on the other side, radiating impatience and menace. "Now, Abel," Croft's voice was smooth as poison. "I've had some news. A report from a town to the east. A woman found dead. 2 children missing, a girl and a baby boy." His blood ran cold. Croft was laying his trap. "Seems this woman was mixed up in some bad business," Croft continued, his voice echoing in the quiet night. "The folks who did her in are probably still looking for those kids. They could be dangerous. If you were to be harboring them, well, that would put you and Lorna in a whole heap of trouble." He was offering a way out. "Give up the children and we'll forget this ever happened." It was a coward's bargain. Abel's hand tightened on the rifle. He thought of Nora's terrified face. He thought of Henry's innocent giggle. He thought of the promise he had made. "I don't know what you're talking about, Sheriff," Abel said, his voice flat and hard. "There are no children here." Another pause. Longer this time. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threats. "That's a shame, Abel," Croft said, and all the false friendliness was gone from his voice. It was replaced by something cold and reptilian. "Because if I have to come back with a warrant and find you've been lying to me, well, the law takes a dim view of that." The sound of his horse's hooves faded into the night, but Abel knew this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Croft had shown his hand. He had confirmed he was the killer, and he had made it clear he knew the children were here. He was going to come back. And not with a warrant. He would come back with men. He would come back to burn them out. Abel turned from the door, his face set like stone. Lorna came out of the back room, her eyes wide with fear. Nora crept out behind her. "What do we do?" Lorna whispered. Abel looked around the small cabin. His home, the place he had built with his own 2 hands. It was no longer a fortress. It was a tomb. They couldn't stay here. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and the law itself was their enemy. Running was the only option. "Pack what you can carry," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Food, water, blankets. We're leaving, tonight." Lorna didn't question him. She started moving, her actions swift and efficient. Abel went to Nora. He knelt down in front of her. "You are the bravest girl I have ever known," he said, taking the precious bird from her and tucking it deep inside his own coat. "We're going to get through this." She nodded, her lower lip trembling. The fire he'd seen in her was nearly extinguished, replaced by the exhaustion of a child who had been running for too long. They worked in silence, the only sounds the rustle of cloth and the clink of canteens. Abel planned their route. They couldn't take the road. Croft would be watching it. They would have to go overland through the rough country to the south. It would be hard, dangerous, especially with a baby. But it was their only chance. As he was packing a small bag with bullets and dried meat, his hand brushed against an old, leather-bound Bible on the mantel. It had been his father's. He opened it, and a faded photograph fell out. It was a picture of two young men, their arms thrown around each other's shoulders, squinting in the sun. One was his father, barely a man. The other, he didn't recognize him. On the back, in his father's faded script, were two names, Elias Harrow and Jacob Vance. Vance. He'd never heard the name before. He was about to put it away when he saw Lorna staring at it, her face pale. "What is it?" he asked. "Sarah's last name," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The children. Nora told me their full names this afternoon." Abel's heart stopped. What was it? "Their name isn't Croft. It's Vance," she said. "Nora and Henry Vance. The world spun. Jacob Vance. The man in the photograph with his father was their grandfather. Sarah hadn't sent her children to strangers. She had sent them to the one place she thought they would be safe. She had sent them to family they didn't even know they had. This wasn't just a matter of charity anymore. This wasn't a stranger's fight they had stumbled into. This was blood. The revelation changed everything. The fight wasn't just for two orphans anymore. It was for his own kin, a family he never knew he had. He looked at the photograph, at the smiling face of Jacob Vance. He had his father's eyes. Why had his father never spoken of him? What had happened between these two men who looked like brothers? There was no time for answers. They had to move. Abel blew out the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness. He took Henry from Lorna, the baby's warm weight a comfort against his chest. Lorna took Nora's hand. He opened the back door, the one that led out toward the rolling hills, away from the road. The night air was cold. The sky was a black velvet blanket, studded with a million indifferent stars. They crept out of the cabin, melting into the shadows. Abel took one last look back at his home, the porch beam where he had planned to carve their names, the fields he had plowed, the life he had built. All of it, gone in an instant. They moved quickly and quietly through the tall grass. Every rustle of the wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like a man with a gun. They had been walking for nearly an hour when they heard it, a shout from the direction of the ranch, then another, then the bright, terrible bloom of a torch, then another. Croft hadn't waited for morning. He had come back. They ran. Abel, with Henry bundled in his arms, Lorna pulling Nora along. They scrambled through ravines and over rocky outcrops, the sounds of their pursuers growing closer. Dogs started barking, their bloodthirsty calls echoing across the prairie. They were being hunted like animals. They found a small cave, tucked away under a rocky ledge. It wasn't much, but it was cover. They huddled inside, listening to the sounds of the manhunt. The shouts and the barking grew closer, then faded as the posse moved past them. For now, they were safe, but they were trapped. They spent a cold, miserable night in that cave. Henry whimpered, and Lorna did her best to soothe him. Nora was silent, her small body curled into a tight ball. Abel stood guard at the mouth of the cave, the rifle in his hands, his eyes scanning the darkness. He felt a rage building inside him, a cold, clean anger, unlike anything he had ever known. Croft had taken everything from this family. He had murdered their mother, and now he was trying to murder them. He had turned the law into his own personal weapon. Abel would not let him win. This ended now, one way or another. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink, a new plan formed in his mind. A dangerous, desperate plan. Running wasn't the answer. They could run forever, and Croft would never stop hunting them. The only way to end this was to fight back, to expose him, to take the one thing he was willing to kill for and use it against him. "Lorna," he whispered, as the first rays of sun hit the prairie, "I need you to take the children and keep heading south. Follow the creek. In 2 days, you'll reach the old mission. You'll be safe there." "What about you?" she asked, her eyes full of fear. "I'm going back," he said. "Abel, no, they'll kill you." "They're going to kill us all anyway if we just keep running," he said, his voice grim. He took the wooden bird from his coat. He carefully worked the two halves apart. Inside, nestled in a small hollow, was a tiny, rolled-up piece of parchment. The deed. "I'm going to take this into town," he said, "not to the sheriff, to the judge. Judge Peterson is an honest man. If I can get this to him, Croft is finished." It was a suicide mission. The town was controlled by Croft. His deputies, the shopkeeper, who knew how many others, were all in his pocket. Walking in there with the deed was like walking into a lion's den covered in meat. But it was their only chance. He looked at his wife, at the two children who were now his own. He saw the terror in their eyes, but he also saw a glimmer of hope. He kissed Lorna. He kissed Henry's sleeping head. Then he knelt in front of Nora. "I will come back for you," he said, looking her straight in the eye. "I promise." She didn't cry. She just nodded, her small face solemn. She reached out and touched his cheek. "Be careful, Papa," she whispered. The word hit him like a thunderbolt. "Papa!" He turned and slipped out of the cave before the emotion could overwhelm him. He moved through the dawn light, a ghost on the land, heading not away from the danger, but straight into its heart. The journey to town was a nerve-wracking ordeal. Abel stayed off the main road, sticking to the gullies and thickets, moving like a shadow. He knew Croft's men would be everywhere. Twice he had to dive for cover as riders passed by, their rifles held at the ready. He reached the edge of town around midday. He stashed his rifle under a pile of rocks. He couldn't walk in there armed. It would be an excuse for Croft to shoot him on sight. He had to rely on his wits. He walked down the main street, his heart pounding in his chest. Every face he saw was a potential enemy. The blacksmith stopped hammering and watched him pass. The men on the porch of the saloon went quiet. He was a marked man. Judge Peterson's office was at the far end of town, right next to the chapel. It felt like a mile away. He was halfway there when a voice called out his name. "Harrow!" It was Croft. He was standing on the steps of the sheriff's office, flanked by two deputies. A smug, triumphant smile was on his face. "Fancy seeing you here," Croft said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "I thought you'd be long gone by now. Looking for something?" Abel kept walking, his eyes fixed on the judge's office. "I have business with the judge, Silas." "Is that right?" Croft stepped down into the street, blocking his path. "Now, I don't think the judge wants to be bothered. Why don't you come inside my office and we can have a little chat?" "I've got nothing to say to you," Abel said, his voice low. Croft's smile vanished. "I think you do," he sneered. "I think you have something that belongs to me. A little piece of paper. Now you can give it to me nice and easy, and maybe I'll let your new little family live. Or you can do this the hard way." The street was silent. The whole town was watching. This was it, the final confrontation. Abel looked at Croft's cold, dead eyes. There was no bargaining with a man like this. He would never let them live. They knew too much. "The only thing I have for you," Abel said, his voice ringing out in the still air, "is a reckoning." He lunged, not at Croft, but to the side. He shoved one of the deputies into the other, sending them stumbling. He broke into a run, sprinting for the judge's office. A shot rang out. The bullet whizzed past his ear. Another shot kicked up dust at his feet. He was a dozen yards from the door. 10, 5. He slammed into the door, bursting into the judge's office. Judge Peterson, a frail-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his desk in shock. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Sheriff Croft murdered Sarah Vance," Abel yelled, throwing the deed onto the judge's desk. "This is the proof. He's trying to kill her children." The door burst open again. Croft stood there, his pistol smoking in his hand, his face a mask of pure fury. "He's insane, Judge!" Croft snarled. "He's a kidnapper and a liar!" "Read the deed, Judge!" Abel yelled. "It's all there! The spring, the land, everything!" Judge Peterson picked up the fragile parchment. His eyes scanned the document. His face went pale. He looked from the deed to Croft, and his expression hardened. "Silas," the judge said, his voice shaking but firm, "you are under arrest for the murder of Sarah Vance." For a moment, Croft just stood there, stunned. He had lost. He had been so close, and he had lost. His face contorted in a snarl of rage. He raised his pistol, not at Abel, but at the judge. "No one arrests me," he hissed. Before he could fire, Abel charged. He slammed into Croft with all his weight, the force of a freight train. They crashed through the office window, landing in a shower of glass and splintered wood on the street outside. The gun went skittering across the dust. Abel and Croft wrestled on the ground, a desperate, brutal fight for survival. Croft was strong, but Abel was fueled by a righteous fury. He landed a punch that snapped Croft's head back. He grabbed a piece of the broken window frame and raised it to strike, but he stopped. He looked at the bloodied, beaten man beneath him. Killing him would be justice, but it would also make him a murderer. He threw the piece of wood aside. "It's over, Silas," he panted. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. One of Croft's deputies had recovered. He was raising his rifle, taking aim at Abel's back. Suddenly, a new sound filled the air, the thunder of hooves. A dozen men, ranchers from the surrounding homesteads, came pouring into the street. They were armed with rifles and shotguns. At the head of them was the preacher from the church. "Drop your weapon," the preacher commanded the deputy. "The reign of Silas Croft is over." The townsfolk, who had been watching in silent fear, erupted. They surged forward, surrounding Croft and his deputies. The spell of fear was broken. Abel staggered to his feet, bruised and bleeding, but alive. He had done it. He had faced the devil and won. Later, after Croft and his men were locked in their own cells, Judge Peterson explained what had happened. Lorna had not gone to the mission. She had taken the children to the church. She had shown the preacher the photograph of Jacob Vance and Elias Harrow. The preacher, a man who had known Abel's father, had told her the story. Jacob Vance and Elias Harrow had been best friends, almost brothers. They had bought the adjoining ranches together. But there had been a terrible falling out over water rights, the very spring that Croft had tried to steal. Harsh words were exchanged. Jacob Vance sold his land for a pittance and moved away. His friendship with Elias shattered. It was a shame Elias Harrow had carried to his grave. When the preacher heard that Jacob's grandchildren were in danger, he had ridden out and rallied the other ranchers, the good, decent people who had been too afraid to stand up to Croft alone. Together they were strong. Abel walked to the church. Lorna ran out to meet him, throwing her arms around him. Nora and Henry were right behind her. Nora ran into his arms, burying her face in his chest. "You came back," she sobbed. "You promised." "I promised," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he held his daughter tight. They went back to the ranch. It was a mess, ransacked by Croft's men, but it was still standing. It was still home. That evening, as the sun set, Abel took his knife. He went to the porch beam. Lorna and the children watched as he began to carve. He carved Abel, then Lorna. Then, with slow, careful strokes, he carved Nora. And finally, Henry. 4 names, a family, forged not by blood, but by courage and love, bound together by a promise. He stepped back and looked at his work. He looked at his wife and his children, their faces glowing in the warm light from the cabin. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long was gone, replaced by a love so fierce it felt like it could move mountains. The whispers in town had stopped. The shadows on the prairie no longer held any fear. The world was still a hard place, but they would face it together. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be trials. There would be scars. But as he pulled his family close, under the wide, starry sky, Abel Harrow knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was finally, truly, home. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. And if you enjoyed this story of justice and family, please subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. Thank you.